Hello and welcome to episode 45 and 46, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena and Civil Military Affairs. This topic that we are having today on the episode is very different than what we have discussed previously in other episodes. Previous episodes were more about tactical military utilities, espionage in the space industry, as well as several aspects of military satellites. But this topic is a little more, actually, it involves a lot of civil perspective as well. So, without any delay, I would like to welcome Marek Posard. Hi, Marek. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for your time. I've been very much curious to have you on the podcast because the moment you mention UAPs, it's a completely different domain, I would say, for our audience. So yeah, thank you very much again for your time. So before taking a jump into the topic, can you provide a brief overview about yourself, your background, and how did you end up being an expert in this domain?
I'm a military sociologist by training, and there's two areas of research that I primarily have focused on at RAND. The first looks at mis and disinformation, falsehoods, particularly online, and I did work on countering foreign election interference in the 2020 U.S. presidential election, which really focused on falsehoods that can kind of emerge and circulate online. The other area looks at civil military relations as it relates to how the US military and other militaries around the world interface with the broader civilian society that it's essentially a part of. And so these two kind of come together with this interesting topics related to unidentified aerial phenomenon because there's a lot of falsehoods, and in some cases conspiracy theories circulating about UAPs, and a lot of it is located at the intersection of civil military relations. And so perceptions that there are cover-ups and where the sourcing of these UAPs come from. And so at RAND, I proposed an internally funded study that essentially tried to ask a simple question: where are civilians claiming they see UAPs over time? And so what we essentially did was a research project that looked at essentially a geographic analysis to figure out where are people actually reporting that they see something that they can't readily identify.
Okay, interesting. That's a very interesting perspective, and I hope you keep on contributing to this research, and we see more and more developments through this. So yeah, proceeding ahead, because we have a very broad range of audience, I'm pretty sure people from the defense side of the podcast, people who listen consistently from the defense audience, especially, I believe they're very much aware about UAPs. But this question is basically for the other people from the space security domain. So, what are unidentified aerial phenomena, that is UAP, and why have they garnered so much attention in recent years?
So there's a lot of different definitions for UAPs. I mean, and some still call them UFOs, some call them anomalous phenomenon. The definition we kind of used for our research was unidentified aerial phenomenon as a term, and we essentially clearly defined it as anything in the sky that cannot be readily identified by the observer. And I think that's important because being readily identified is going to be different if you're a Navy pilot versus a civilian working outside in rural Oklahoma. And so I think one thing that gets back at the civil military issue is how readily identified something flying in the sky is going to be very different if it's a civilian versus a professionally trained service member. And I think in our research, we're really interested in the general public for the most part. And so we're looking at what are people saying they see in the sky that they don't really know what it is, and would cause them enough concern to actually report it to some type of external entity. In this case, in our research, it was the National UFO Reporting Center.
Okay. And just I would say a little bit proceeding ahead, how do UAP sightings impact the military readiness and defense capabilities? Because we had seen some of the cases in the UFO domain as well. A lot which actually end up as an hoax and all. But regarding UAPs, it's more related to security. So, what is your perspective on its impact on military and defense capabilities?
So I think there's at least two areas that catch my eye here. The first is there's a lot of conspiracy theories about UAPs, and I think it can in some cases undermine a healthy civil military relationship. Um,
Okay.
I didn't actually answer your question earlier about why does this garner so much attention. And in our report, we actually show that the number of reports kind of go up and down over time. And I would suspect that probably during the pandemic, you have a lot of people kind of cooped up at home, and there's probably much more. This is kind of can be an interesting topic, particularly if you tie it to the prospect of extraterrestrials. And so as a result, you know, there can be a lot of conspiracy theories that can emerge, and those can take a really kind of darker turn when it becomes anti-government in nature. And particularly if there's this belief that there's this massive cover up, or there's this kind of secret military industrial complex that's trying to hide something, when in reality what is flying in the sky is not actually something that's being hidden. In some cases it could just be a balloon or a satellite or a star or whatnot. I also think that there is impact for the need to recognize emerging and potential threats from the homeland or from our adversaries. And I think one area of concern is that we talk about in the report is that more people are just flying stuff in the sky. And so there's more
Yes.
opportunities now and in the future for potential threats to be there. It could be surveillance drones, it could be terrorist activity, and we want the public to be reporting this stuff if they can't readily identify it. And that's an area where I think for readiness and defense capabilities, we really need to be concerned of is it's how much of it is a extraterrestrial threat, which may or may not exist. I'm not an expert on
Yes.
extraterrestrials, but I know for a fact there's a ton of terrestrial threats that we need to keep our
Yes.
eye in the sky for. And I think that's kind of my primary focus that should demand our attention, in my humble opinion.
Yes. And I mean, just to add a layer onto this, because you have provided some good insights. So, can you provide an example of UAP encounters that have involved primarily military personnel, and what were their outcomes? Especially, given the fact that the world recently observed the Chinese balloon incident as well.
Well, and I think this is a great point that you raise, is that there's a lot of different types of encounters of things flying in the sky that one cannot
Yeah.
readily know what it is, and it's not aliens and it's not like extraterrestrial spaceships necessarily. Like we've seen this with the weather balloon, the Chinese surveillance balloon,
Yes.
where I did not see anyone forecasting that actually would happen. And again, you see like a response to observing it flying across the country and then eventually shooting it down. There's been reports in the past of flying black triangles that turned out to be what we call stealth fighters today. And there's even situations like the Constant Tent program, where the Air Force had secret squadrons of Soviet aircraft that were operated by American pilots, and the goal there was to essentially use them to sneak up on pilots during training exercises to eliminate the buck fever, so to speak, that shock that a pilot might have by seeing a Soviet MiG up close for the first time. That was something we did back, I believe, in the 80s, maybe even earlier. And these are things, again, like they're not aliens, they're not extraterrestrials, but there's a lot of different things flying in the sky that are being used, particularly on the defense side, that
Yes.
can, if you see it, you might be kind of startled or concerned. And a lot of it today is using for test and evaluation purposes, particularly in our military operations areas.
Yes. Yeah. And from, I would say, these incidents actually, the hamper, I would say, the security infrastructure, the way security operates, especially, I believe it's for the national security more than, international security, I would say, because uh, Chinese balloon was spotted in the United States. So of course, it includes the US territories in that. So what potential national security concerns are associated with UAPs, and how are these concerns being addressed from your perspective?
So, um, the big thing in our research was that there's this larger trend that we call the democratization of air power. Again, more people, companies, countries have access to the tools of air power than in the past. And like you or I can go on Amazon or walk into a local Costco warehouse and buy a drone, and we could alter that drone and we could use it for surveillance purposes. There was a guy in Connecticut, for example, that put a firearm on a gun, or I'm sorry, a firearm on a drone and flew it up in the sky. And the US has a lot of airspace. So we have 5.3 million
Yes.
square miles of domestic airspace, 24 million square miles of oceanic airspace. That's all, and there's only so many pennies in a dollar. And so one thing that we want to make sure, though, is that people are actually reporting legitimate threats, not cooking up conspiracy theories. And in our research, when we looked at 24 plus years of reports to the National UFO Reporting Center, which is a data source that has a lot of limitations that we are very clear about, but it is a longitudinal data set that essentially crowdsources anything and everything being reported.
Okay.
One of the best predictors was people who are living near what's called military operations areas. Essentially, it's places where they conduct training exercises. They might test and evaluate various types of equipment. And that stuff's not necessarily near major military installations in the US. There's one off the coast of Sheboygan, Wisconsin. There's one in the western part of Iowa. And so if we're testing equipment or we are testing new technology or just doing training exercises, it's not super healthy for civil military relations for people to be freaked out or start cooking up conspiracy theories about some type of extraterrestrial visiting when it may just be a flare from a military exercise. And on top of that, there's concerns too that, could we be having adversaries potentially using air power to start kind of collecting information? The example I've used in the past is imagine like we have a network of Amazon drones delivering various types of things to people's homes in the
Yes.
future. And the Chinese essentially make a surveillance drone look like an Amazon delivery drone. We want the public to say that drone seems to be kind of acting bizarre relative to what I've seen in my neighborhood and reporting it to someone. And those are the kinds of risks I think we're going to see with the democratization of air power going forward. And there's probably going to need to be a more public engagement and a response to start trying to kind of essentially get a handle on where these risks might be emerging.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very insightful example, I would say. The Amazon drone that you mentioned. And, just before moving ahead on the cooperative effort, this is just out of a personal curiosity that I'm asking. So, have you personally spotted or, engaged in the sightings of UAPs?
I think we all have, right? And again, I think the key here is that UAPs don't equal extraterrestrials. And I'll give you an
Yeah,
example.
yeah, yeah. Yes.
Last night, my newborn son, my infant son, was awakened by a low flying plane that was flying over our house. My suspicion was it's probably going to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. I don't
Yes.
really know what that was, and I looked up and I can't really tell what it was. So in that case, I couldn't identify what it was. And when I looked
All
online
right.
to see
Okay.
what planes are flying, there was nothing showing up. That I can tell you right
Yes.
now, that's not an extraterrestrial. That was probably a military aircraft. That's not like they're not just disclosing like publicly, the flight plans. But I think that's
Yes.
one thing to take away is that there's a lot of like
Yeah.
UAP sightings. I think we all see it. We just don't know what it is. And we don't have the proper information or knowledge. And again, it's not an alien. It's probably not an extraterrestrial. I mean, I want to be clear. I'm not an expert on that stuff, so I can't speak to that. But the vast majority of my working hypothesis is that these are terrestrial phenomena. And if there's an
Yes.
extraterrestrial component, that's up to NASA and others to kind of address. But we want to separate that out from what the majority of the potential threats and risks and concerns and even unconcerned, not, sightings that aren't concerning that are flying, which are sourced from terrestrial, or basically coming from terrestrial sources, so to speak.
Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, this is a clear definition now that you mentioned about. I mean, we all have spotted somewhere or the other. Even I have spotted. Maybe I'm just not recalling now the incident, but I think as the definition gets much more clearer in my mind, I might be able to report it.
Well,
And yeah,
and just as a follow up to that, in our finding, our original hypothesis was distance to military
yeah,
installations. We thought like there's a lot of different activities that occur around installations. People may not know it. That actually
yes,
wasn't a consistent predictor. The predictor was these MOAs, which a lot of people don't know that they are living near or traveling under or around. And, there are military operations areas above Jamaica, Vermont, Storm Lake, Iowa, as I mentioned, off the coast of Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And if you look at,
Yes.
they rarely are creating new, they're called MOAs, but what they do is they might adjust the sizes. And when they do, there's usually public notice about this. I don't think a lot of the public are actually like reading these things, but you'll see them online. And they'll talk about some of these MOAs. They're not always they're not always active, and B, people don't always know that they're when they are active, and C, they
Yes.
can actually the activities can get sometimes quite low, like a few hundred feet above ground level. So can you imagine driving through underneath a MOA at night in Jamaica, Vermont, and then you start seeing maybe just a flare or two from a military exercise that's 500 feet above ground level. I mean, a civilian who doesn't know anything about the military, that might freak you out. And I think,
Yes.
those are the things that are kind of concerning to me as a sociologist is, do civilians understand what's going on and why? And I think we can go a long way in bringing down the temperature by just having
Yes.
better communication.
Yes. And I mean, this is actually much more. This question is much more, I would say, international perspective. So, are there any international implications or cooperative efforts regarding UAP investigations between different countries, military and defense agencies?
I think the biggest issue is legitimate threat detection. Um, and like I mentioned before, UAPs don't equal aliens. And in fact, you know, probably we need to prioritize threats. And I'm not saying there
Yes.
are not threats from other planets and outside extraterrestrials, but I am saying that in the spectrum of threats we got to prioritize, I am very confident that there are terrestrial threats that exist in this world. And by terrestrial threats, I mean like foreign adversaries, domestic terrorists, you name it. And I think one thing that we need to do is having kind of a system that focuses on collecting quality data so we can prioritize the terrestrial threat. And by the way, if one is interested in the extraterrestrial threat, separating out the terrestrial and the extraterrestrial will essentially get you to the same outcome. But I do think that from international implications is the degree of, because of this democratization of air power, um, attribution of who's doing what, because if so many people have access to the tools of air power, is going to be more difficult. And it's going to lead to a rise in espionage, a rise to threats from terrorism, and a rise
Yes.
to threats of potential state actors and being involved. I mean, you see this with Ukraine, right? The use of drones are becoming an important tool, particularly amongst civilians. And so those are the things we need to cooperate on, to collect information to figure out where the threats are coming from and why. And I think they can go a long way in terms of mitigating essentially the risks and threats coming from the democratization of air power.
Interesting. And it is at a very good point you mentioned about espionage. I mean, just proceeding ahead, because ahead of this, we'll be discussing more about civil affairs. So just to, kind of briefly to touch upon this point, I believe these activities are carried out as a part of espionage ring. So what are your, I mean, thoughts, and can you provide us, I would say a little bit perspective on the relation of UAPs and espionage in a brief manner? I mean, we don't have to take a deep dive, of course.
Oh no, I mean, I think there's always the issue of collecting, image or video intelligence, right? And also the
Yes.
issue of signal intelligence, intercepting various types of signals. The truth of the matter is drones are getting smaller, and the
Yes.
sensing capabilities are improving. And so you don't need to have this massive predator drone flying around above your house to collect information. In the future, what we might start seeing is drones that look like bugs, micro drones. And
Yes.
those are the kinds of things where if it looks suspicious and odd and it's really small and tiny to see, it could collect a lot of information and for a longer period of time without people knowing. And when you see something, we want individuals reporting suspicious activity in the future, because we want to be able to essentially crowdsource where our adversaries might be trying to deploy these capabilities. And that's where you
Yes.
get you move the UAP issue away from the extraterrestrial focus to more of the terrestrial risks, particularly with smaller drones that more people have access to, I think there's going to be a lot of concerning trends and opportunities to kind of mitigate those risks going forward.